Thank you everyone for coming. This is our second brown bag meeting of the year, and I think this is going to be a spectacular presentation. I want to give a brief introduction, and then I'm going to sit down and get quiet because these guys have a lot to tell you, and they've done a lot of work to get ready. Probably many people in this room already know who these three individuals are, but I'll just go through the formalities. And I'm Jennifer, the chair of this section. Here we have Craig Harai, who's the executive director of the Hawaii Housing Finance and Development Corporation. Craig has been executive director for what, about 4 or 5 years over there?
No, like 1 year.
Okay. Wow, not that long, but Craig has got an incredibly impressive background. He has been, let's see, chair of Affordable Housing Subcommittee of the Government Affairs Committee of the Hawaii Association of Realtors, chair of the State Rental Housing Trust Fund Commission, ex officio member of the predecessor agency, Housing Community Development Corporation of Hawaii, chair of the State Tax Review Commission, chair of the Board of Directors of the Tax Foundation of Hawaii, chair of the Professional Ethics Committee of the Hawaii Society of Certified Public Accountants. And that's just a few of Craig's notable accomplishments. He has a master's of science in accounting, a master's in business administration. He also holds a JD and a master of law in taxation. And he's a member of our section. So Craig is a CPA, a JD, and the head of the agency. He's going to help us learn about low-income housing tax credits. To help him out with that, we've got Darren Iweki, who's a finance manager at LIHTC, and you've been in that position since 2001. Okay. But he's been with the agency for about 25 years. And during the time that he's been finance manager, I've got to read this, you've seen the allocation of close to $770 million of federal and state low-income housing tax credits, which resulted in the development or assisting the development of 4,900 units in 52 projects. In addition to the low-income housing tax credit program, he oversees the administration of other rental housing financing programs like Hula Main Multifamily Bond Program and the Rental Housing Trust Fund that we mentioned earlier. And then finally, we have John Pang, who maybe many of you know. He's also a member of our section and a former chair. And John Pang is an attorney, obviously. He's a managing director at the firm Case Lombardi and Pettit. He does a lot of real estate practice. That's the main focus of your practice. But for today's presentation, what I think John is really going to be able to bring to us is that he's the author of the chapter entitled Affordable Housing and Government Programs that was in the Real Estate Manual, Volume 2. Yeah, Volume 2 that was published in 2010. John actually authored that. So these three guys here are probably the experts in the entire state on low-income affordable housing tax credits, and they've got a couple of great things that they've put together. Hopefully everybody got a chance to look on the website. The PowerPoint presentation and the outline were posted to the website last night. There's not copies here, so if you didn't get a chance, you can go ahead and pull them off the website when you get back to your office. Thank you, gentlemen, very much.
Well, thanks, Jennifer, for that great introductions. I've known Darren for a while now. We did, I guess, our first project in 2001. Just about when, yeah. And then Craig I've known, because Craig used to be with Torkelson and with Hunsaker.
Yeah, Hunsaker.
Right, for a while. And, I guess, contrary to what Jennifer says, I'm not the expert. There are a bunch of people in this room who are equally as expert here in tax credits. But what we were going to try to do today is give you a basic overview of the tax credit program, and so I thought we'd get some basics of the legal requirements of it, but try to transition that into, in practice, how you would get them awarded to your client if you had a client that was interested in getting tax credits. And a lot of it I guess, implemented by HFDC, and Craig is the ED, and Darren is the finance manager, and they are the people you need to keep happy or to satisfy in order to get your allocation. So I thought we'd first go into the overview of low-income housing tax credits, and because it's such a long name, I'm just going to refer to it as LIHTC. So, so generally, this is not something. There we go. Generally, low-income housing tax credits is a federal income tax credit that's authorized by Section 42 of the Internal Revenue Code, under which owners of residential real property can claim a credit owners of residential real property that is rented to low-income tenants. They can claim a credit that's a dollar-for-dollar credit. So it is generally an incentive created by Congress for private developers to generate equity funding for their projects. The taxpayers receive a federal subsidy by claiming a credit.
Hi. Calling in for the real property session.
Yes, me too. I can't hear anything though.
Yeah, me too.
Can you hear the line now? Hello?
No. Yes, I can hear somebody speaking. Is that?
Okay, great. The session started, so go
Alright.
ahead,
Yeah, we just turned the volume up.
hit mute.
Oh, okay. Couldn't hear anything before.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Please go ahead, John.
So anyway, let me backtrack a little bit. It is a federal subsidy that created by Congress as an incentive for private developers and investors to partner to create affordable rental housing. It's taxpayers are entitled to claim a tax credit, which is a one-to-one, a dollar-to-dollar credit, not a deduction, that's prorated over 10 years. And it applies to both newly constructed and also renovated projects. Generally, how it works is that a project owner will propose a project to the state housing agency, which is HFDC in this case, and applies for and is awarded an allocation of credits. Then once it gets the credits, it will complete the project, certify the development costs, and then rent out the project to low-income tenants. The allocation of LIHTC enables the project owner to raise equity capital to fund development costs for their projects. How this happens is the project owner will, what they call, syndicate the credit to an investor or group of investors. Most times the project owner is a partnership, and through, I guess, partnership allocations, the investor becomes a limited partner in the project. Then it makes, as a limited partner of the project, it makes a capital contribution to the partnership. Then the capital contribution is used by the entity, project entity, to pay for development costs. In exchange, limited partner investor gets allocated a certain portion of the profits, losses, depreciation in the partnership. A lot of times it is 99.9% of those losses. So by being a part of the owner, the investor can claim the credit, okay? And this credit is claimable over 10 years, a 10-year period. So the amount of credits is based upon the amount of credits awarded to the project, the actual cost of the project, which is a qualified basis, which is determined after it's done, and the tax credit rate announced by the IRS, and the percentage of units rented to low-income tenants. Now, there are some technical requirements in order for a project to qualify. Under section 42, the property needs to be a qualified low-income building. And for it to be a qualified low-income building, it needs to be residential real property, so it has to be rental and residential. It has to be rent restricted. In other words, the amount of rent that the owner can charge to the low-income tenant is limited, and it's limited to 30% of their maximum eligible income. The rent includes utilities, but excludes any Section 8 subsidies that they may get from HUD. The developer also needs to, I guess, agree to rent the project to low-income housing, low-income tenants. And that's what they call the minimum set-asides. In order for the project to qualify, it has to satisfy one of two tests. Called the 20 to 50 test, which is 20% of the units need to be set aside for occupancy by households with incomes not exceeding 50% of the area median income. That's determined by HUD. Or the 40-60 test, which is 40% of the units are set aside for occupancy by household with incomes that do not exceed 60% AMI. Now, because the allocation of tax credits, in large part is competitive, a project owner will typically agree to a higher percentage of low-income occupancy. A lot of times 100%, in other words, all of the units would be low income or a lower income level. So I guess the minimum is 50% of AMI and GI, and sometimes they agree to a lower level, which could be 40%, 30%. When you get down to 30%, it's pretty low income. Now, once the credits are allocated, the project needs to comply with these minimum set-asides for a minimum of actually 30 years. An initial 15-year period. They have to make sure that they satisfy these minimum set-asides, that their rent is restricted. If they don't comply within those 15 years, their credits are subject to recapture, which means all of the past credits that they've taken are recaptured and need to be paid back that tax. And all of their future credits are forfeited. And then there's an additional extended period, which 15-year period, which they need to comply. So there's an ongoing compliance requirement, which requires them to annually certify that the building continues to be a qualified low-income building, and that the tenants all qualify as low-income tenants. So in other words, annually they have to be certified that their income does not exceed the minimum set aside. Okay. Now, from a lawyer's standpoint, one of the critical documents that you need to be aware of is a regulatory agreement. So all of these requirements that bind of these set-asides and that sort of thing is going to be incorporated into a regulatory agreement that is recorded against your project, and it will be recorded for the compliance period that you agreed to. I think that's the basic requirements. So if you guys have any questions, anybody have any questions before we move on to the, shall we say, practical ways of getting credits awarded? Any questions? I think I might have been pretty quick, but, so what I'm gonna do is turn it over to Darren, and Darren's gonna go through HFDC and, I mean, HFDC, that shows my age. And the process that HFDC goes through when your clients want to get awarded the credits.
Thanks, John. And maybe just add a little more to what John introduced to you as far as what the program is about. The program really came about through the Tax Reform Act of 1986, and I think the government was reaching a point where they realized that they had done all of these projects that were government-owned and sponsored in the 50s and 60s, and there just wasn't enough money. And it was the tax credit program really was a way to bring in the private sector. All of these projects are obviously privately owned. So in essence, the government becomes almost a financier. So with that being said, how much in tax credits does the state get? That's always the big question. And like any government program, the magic is in the formula. It's formula driven. The 9%, there's a 9% what we call competitive or volume cap program under the tax credit program, and they're allocated to states based on population. For the state of Hawaii, and I'm using 2014 as the example, we received roughly about $3.23 million. And we do a quick calculation underneath that. Every year, the IRS publishes what we call a LIHTC rate, which in this case was $2.30, and you multiply that by your state's population. Of course, there is a small state minimum, or there are states that are smaller than us, so we're just above that small state minimum, which is $3 million at our $3.23 million. In addition, you've also, if you've heard about the program, you've also probably heard about a 4% LIHTC program. And it's, technically, I guess you'd say they're very similar. The LIHTC is sold through syndication to generate equity, but there are some differences, and I'll talk about that a little later. But the biggest key being that in order to qualify for the 4% LIHTC, you need to use private activity tax exempt bonds. So you may hear on the streets, people may say there is a finite amount of 9% credits based on the calculation I just went through, but really there's an unlimited amount of 4% credits that we can allocate. Really not true. It's based on the amount of bond cap that the state has. And in the case of the state of Hawaii, we receive approximately $296 million. When putting together a 4% credit deal, you would need to gain a portion of this $296 million. At least 50% of the project would need to be financed using this form of tax exempt bonds. And by using the bonds, that triggers the 4% credits. In addition to both the 9% and the 4% federal LIHTC programs, the state of Hawaii also introduced a LIHTC program of its own. And it equates to 50% of whatever you receive at the federal level. It's an automatic gift at this point. A handful of years ago, we went into the legislature to bifurcate the credits, the state and the federal credit apart from each other, so they can be sold to two separate entities if need be. And anything else about this credit?
No, what the state credit though is that actually can be, it's not linked to the federal. So when when an investor comes in, the amount of federal credits allocated to the state, to the investor can be a different proportion than the state credits. They don't have to match. So a lot of times what happens is that you will have a investor, and it's usually a group of investors, and they take pieces. So you'll have the limited partner that's coming in investor, but they'll have a whole, I guess a group of sub-limited partners below them. They will, sometimes, this enables them to have a state limited partner where they can allocate a lot of the state credits, because a lot of the mainland investors are not gonna use state credits. So, before, and that was, I guess, specifically, provided for and authorized by the, regs with the statute. The statute, right. And because before that, essentially state credits were not useful because the mainland investors couldn't use them, so you couldn't raise very much for them.
It was a matter of finding the needle in the haystack, I think is what you'd call it, you know, finding an investor that had the federal liability as well as Hawaii state. So the bifurcation did help the state credit. The state credit continues to be challenged, you know, and obviously it's pure economics. At the federal level, you can find anybody in the United States that has a tax liability and the amount of credits that you may have, and they can invest. In the case of the state credit, obviously, they have to have Hawaii state liability, and it's a much smaller pool. But from a developer standpoint, it's still equity. You know, and to the extent that the project meets the requirements of the tax credit program over the 15-year initial affordability period, that tax credit equity, basically, the risk goes away, I think, at that point. You know, and it's very key in the financial wherewithal of these low-income rental projects, that cash be there. They're so cash challenged. As John mentioned earlier, you're looking at, on the top end, hitting people earning 60% of the area median income. You take all that into account, the amount of conventional debt that a project can carry, they wouldn't be able to do it on their own without something like the tax credits. So now, how are the tax credits awarded? You know, there's no real secret behind it. We have tried to be as transparent as we can be. The tax credits are awarded using what is known as a qualified allocation plan, or better known as QAP. Government is famous for acronyms. The QAP is a point-based system which takes into account mandated requirements placed upon us through by the IRS through the tax credit program. But the IRS also allows us to take into account any kind of priorities that the state may have. It also contains other requirements that are expected of anybody using the program. John talked a little bit about compliance requirements and things of that nature. So the QAP is really the very starting point of the whole process. Now in the next slide, and it's a little fuzzy, didn't come out as clear as I wanted to, but there are 17 criteria within the QAP itself. They're all scored. It totals out to 120 points. But if you look at the 17 criterion, there are really 5 that stand out based on the amount of points that are allocated to them. And obviously, those are areas that we feel are very important. And these areas are really, as a government agency, because we have limited resources, whether they be state credits or any other financing resources that we have, we're always looking to get the best leverage that we can. So a project coming in that is asking for just tax credits and say monies from the state trust fund, it wouldn't score out as well. We're looking for somebody to utilize our programs, but also pound the pavement, find other sources, and they may be other government programs, but we don't want them to be self-reliant on just the tax credit program. We're also looking at the overall a big push would be overall project feasibility. We're looking to get projects that are ready to get into the ground, get them built as quickly as possible. As John mentioned, the program serves a certain income level, but we're also looking to see if potential developer owners are willing to serve even a lower portion of that population. So although the maximum may be 60%, we incentivize people to maybe offer units at the 50% level, the 40% level. Once you get down into that 30% level, it gets pretty challenging. You know, what you can collect in rent from them basically barely covers operational costs, let alone any debt. The other thing we're looking to do, emphasize, and John mentioned it, is the length of affordability that we can keep these projects as low-income rentals. The tax credit program mandates that it be kept affordable for 30 years. Again, we incentivize through points in the scoring system. I think you max out if you can keep it affordable, you make a promise to give us 60 years of affordability. You know, so it's just some examples of how we're mandated to put together this QAP by the IRS, but we can kind of blend it and mold it in the direction of, you know, where the state wants to go.
Could I ask you about one of those, Darren?
Sure.
I see on the list, number 14 is projects offering tenants an opportunity for homeownership.
Yes.
But these are rental projects.
They need to start as rental projects, but the tax credit program allows the project to be converted. It's a one-time opportunity at year 15 into home ownership. As you can see, we only give people
Not too
1
much
point,
credit,
so
yeah.
the great need really is for rentals, you know, but we're required, this is, Jennifer, that would be one of the requirements that we're mandated to have in our QAP that by the IRS. But at this point, we're really not looking to incentivize home ownership at this point. We feel there's a great need for these units for those at 60% and below.
And from a practice standpoint, the only probably way you could do that is to kind of minimize the project. And when you talk to tenants of rental projects, and you mentioned condominium-wise, they get very concerned because they think you're going to market. And when the HUD gets concerned, everybody gets concerned.
I think if you were to look at the inventory of the projects that we finance using the program here in Hawaii, many of them are either mid-rises, you know, 7, 8 stories. We've done high-rises. We've done a bunch of townhome type multi-unit fourplexes or eightplexes. On the mainland, because I think, and part of the reason I think we see it here is we're land challenged, you know, obviously in the cost of land. On the mainland, you see tax credit programs or projects that are single family. And I think, Jennifer, that falls more into it makes it a little easier to become home ownership. It takes away some of the condominium-wise challenges that John spoke about. Developers, we go through the QAP. The QAP is an ever-evolving document, so we accept comments and suggestions throughout the year. But it is published formally once a year, and developers apply for tax credits through the corporation's consolidated application. The application allows an applicant to apply for not only the tax credit program, but it allows them to apply for any of the financing programs that the corporation offers. You know, and some of the ones that may be coupled with the tax credits to do a low-income rental would be our Hulme multifamily bond program, as well as our state rental housing trust fund. So we've tried to just ease the paperwork instead of having to repeat a lot of the same information in multiple applications. It's all in a one-stop shop.
Oh, we'll warn them, these are very long time.
Yeah, John's right. We still do kill a lot of trees and forests because applications can come in upwards of maybe 3-4 inches, but it's better than having, they need to submit 5 copies, I believe it is. You know, so that's a lot of paper.
But the thing is this, but when you're filling it out, you just bear in mind that maybe some of it is not going to be applicable to, you know, so you don't feel you have to fill every time. Yeah.
So of course, because it's done through, we award through a competitive procedure, there are funding rounds that we go through, and typically we have 2 funding rounds per year. The first round, which is usually in the early part of the calendar year, where we will accept applications will include competition for 9% tax credits, as well as applications for 4% tax credits, along with some of the other programs that I mentioned earlier, our Hulume multifamily bonds and Rental Housing Trust Fund. We also have the second round of funding, which typically is mid-year, sometime in maybe midsummer. And at that point, in most cases, we allocated all the competitive 9% credits. But again, we offer the opportunity to apply and compete for 4% credits, as well as whatever we have in the state's trust fund and our other programs. The applications, once submitted, are reviewed by staff members of both our finance branch as well as our development branch. And again, utilizing the QAP as a scoring system, but we use the expertise of both areas to review different portions of the applications. Recommendations for awarding tax credits and other financing resources are eventually vetted with the executive director, obviously at the staff level, and ultimately taken to our board for their final approval. The following is, I'm just going to take you through a really high-level sampling of a financing structure for both a 9% tax credit deal and a 4% tax credit project. And we'll start with the 9%. Typically, whenever a interested party comes in and talks to us, they say, well, what do I need to do? And we said our first expectation is we want to make sure that you are carrying the largest conventional debt that you can. You know, the government's role is to help you fill gaps, not to give you everything you need. So we make sure that they maximize based on cash flow from the project, the amount of money that they can borrow from any of our local banks or our mainland lending entity. So that typically, the project of this nature, for those at 60%, the cash flow from rents can usually carry about 20% of the total project debt. The other big piece that we've been concentrating on is the low-income housing tax credit. In the case of the 9% credits, the equity that's derived through the sale will generally take care of about 55 to 60% of the total project cost. So now you add the 20% of conventional debt, 55, 60% equity from the tax credits, you said, well, you're still short. That middle, what we call equity gap, that's where many of the other government programs come into play. You're basically looking at taking a second position from a mortgage standpoint, but more importantly, you take a second position and it's a soft one. And when I say soft, many of the loans that we do from our state trust fund are cash flow contingent. And they may be, to give you an example, a typical trust fund loan may be 45 years, maybe 1 to 3% interest. Cash flow contingent, where the trust fund will take 75% of any excess cash once you take away cost to operate, your first mortgage. Any cash left over will be split 75-25 between repaying the trust fund and the remaining 25% staying within the project. The thought process of the extended term of this loan is that the trust fund or any other source typically won't get repaid in full until that first mortgage is paid off. Assume it's a 30-year loan. So at the end of 30 years, that money that was being used to pay the first mortgage, the conventional mortgage, is now gone, and all of that cash just basically flows down into the cash contingency, and it's really within that 15-year period, maybe from year 31 through 45, where you get a heavy repayment from the project for the trust fund. Other programs that are used are federal programs that are administered by the counties, the Community Block Development Grant Program, there's the Home Program. HUD programs are really falling by the wayside, but there's still a couple of them out there. For projects in rural areas, there's USDA Rural Development has some programs. But at that point, that middle section, that equity gap, it's typically gonna come from some sort of government source. So that's a typical percentage breakdown on a 9% tax credit project. Moving into a 4% tax credit project, same makeup. You're looking at a first mortgage, tax credit, equity, and something to fill in the gaps. Obviously, 4%, 9% program, common sense tells you the 4% credits, basically you derive less actual equity, and that, in the case of the example I'm using here, about 40%, it'll generate about 40% of the total cost of the project. You'll notice on the conventional or first mortgage at the top, I did stick in Hula May multifamily bonds. What can happen is the bonds are floated, because they're given a tax exempt government rate. They typically have been lower than conventional rates that we can find on the outside, although that's not necessarily true in the environment we're in now. But for simplicity purposes, we'd assume that because you're at a little lower rate, the Hula May multifamily bonds, you can probably hold maybe 20–25%. So maybe another 5% can be carried through conventional debt. What you see grow is that middle bar, the equity gap. That grows, I think in the 9% from 20 to 25 to 35 to 40%. And again, the sources to help fill this gap are the same ones I described through the 9% program. But it is a little more taxing on the government programs such as a trust fund, CDBG home, and other HUD and USD programs. So that gives you a bit of an idea of how the program works, how you structure a deal. If you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer. If not, I'm gonna.
Darren, you've been using all the tax credits or for every year, and can they be carried over?
Yes, so the 9% credits, for the most part, we allocate them out as we receive them. There are certain years where maybe we don't have quite enough to maybe fund the last project, so there may be a little bit left over, or we may have an award that we want to make, but there is an issue that we're working through with the developer, and at the end of the day, we can't come to some sort of meeting of the minds as far as getting comfortable to actually make an award. So the 9% credits, they typically all go out. The 4% credits, I think I mentioned that the need for bond cap. We have never had a problem of getting a share of that $296 million to do a bond credit project over the years. Okay, Carrie?
The low-income projects also get a benefit of general excise tax?
Yes. And
is it for the whole project or just the portion that's low income?
I'm gonna turn that over to my boss. That's kind of his area.
That's the next topic.
Okay.
So
Area of expertise.
you can ask me that after.
Chris?
Have we done anything to pursue the excess federal 9% credits as a state?
Yes, we have. I think what you're talking about is the national pool.
Correct, right, for the 9%, yeah.
Yes, we have in years past. To tell you the truth, it's a lot of work to get a very little amount of credits, but we will go through it. But in order to qualify for that, you would have had to have given out all of your credits.
Right.
And that's kind of the chicken and egg thing, because there are certain years where we give out, and maybe I should have explained to the group that $3.2 million in 9% credits that I talked about typically will allow us to make awards to maybe at least 3 projects, and some years 4. But going back to your question, you never hit that number exactly. So there are years, as long as we have $100,000 left in credits, that negates us from applying for to the
We
national.
should perhaps pursue it legislatively.
But we have in the,
Yeah,
we have in the
okay.
past, and we've gotten, I think the last time we did it, I wanna say may have been back in the late 2000s. We got got an extra like $30,000 in credits.
Yeah.
It's still 30,000, but we did it, so we're aware of it, thanks.
Does the agency try to make sure that all of the counties receive the credits sort of in proportion with the population?
It's an ongoing discussion that we have, you know, as far as how, do we make sure that each island or county gets their fair share. We've thought about it, and we don't have a policy in place, but if you look just at the track record of our awards, the bulk of the projects are here on Oahu, but Maui, the Big Island, and Kauai do get projects, you know, every other year, every third year. So it's not like it's an Oahu-centric program, but we don't have a specific policy saying we have to make sure Maui gets a project every 2 years. So if not, we'll kind of fall into general excise tax exemption. I'll turn it over to Craig.
We didn't put it on.
The handout that you prepared?
Yeah.
I
It was, I
printed
don't think that
copies
was
if you'd like.
included.
I don't know if everybody has it, or they can probably post it later.
The statutes that you sent me.
Yeah.
Yes, there's two things posted on the website right now, this PowerPoint and then like a 5-page, very detailed outline. After this session, I'll post up a bunch of the statutory and rule
Mhm.
references that Darren sent me earlier today.
Yeah, I guess that was stuff I was gonna discuss, speak to Wes's point, but, I think I can go through it, and try and summarize it pretty well, even though you don't have the material in front of you. 'Cause I figured you're all lawyers and you'll understand tax statutes, right? The general excise tax exemption for certified or approved housing projects is contained in the general excise tax law, HRS Chapter 237. It's specifically in HRS Section 237-29-29. And it, granting the exemption, it states that all gross income received by any qualified person or firm for the planning, design, financing, construction, sale, or lease in the state of a housing project that has been certified or approved under Section 201H-36 shall be exempt from general excise tax. So that 237-29A is the exemption section. But as you noted, it refers to 201H-36, which is our HHFDC's chapter 2. So, under 237-29C, we actually have joint jurisdiction with GO-TAX to write rules for this section, which is an interesting point, because I know when I was, many years ago when I was a young tax attorney, the rules for this exemption are not on the GO-TAX website. They're on our website, if you're looking for them. So, I know how many of you have actually worked with this exemption? Okay. But, yeah, so I mean, that's a little trick that, you gotta pick it, because you can search the GO-TAX website for a long time and never find them. 201H, and then there's, under 238-3J, there is a reciprocal use tax exemption, because under the Commerce Clause, you cannot basically give G exemption to a in-state taxpayer, in-state supplier or vendor that you don't give to an out-of-state vendor. So there is a use tax exemption. The site is 238-3J. Getting to 201H36, basically it has to be a project that is newly constructed or moderately or substantially rehabilitated. And there's a definition in 201H36 about what is moderate rehabilitation and what is substantial rehabilitation. And to qualify, the project has to be developed under, I think it's part 2 of Chapter 201H, developed under a government assistance program approved by the corporation, developed under the sponsorship of a private nonprofit organization providing home rehabilitation or new homes for qualified families in need of decent low-cost housing, or developed by a qualified person or firm to provide affordable rental housing where at least 50% of the available units are for households with incomes at or below 80% of the area median income as defined by HUD, of which at least 20% of the available units are for households with incomes at or below 60% of the area median income as determined by HUD. Before I get to the rules, which kind of add substance to what I just read, the counties are also allowed to give general excise tax exemption under 46-15.1. But the language is provided further that county projects shall be granted an exemption from general excise or receipts taxes in the same manner as projects of the HHFDC pursuant to 201H-36. We read that to mean that they need to follow our rules. I'm not so sure, the counties all look at it that way, but that's what the enabling statute says, okay? So our rules, like I said, our rules are on our website, and it'll say general excise tax exemptions, and it's 15, HAR 15-306-15. And a lot of it is in the definitions. For example, developed under the sponsorship of a private nonprofit corporation means a newly constructed or moderately or substantially rehabilitated housing project developed under a program qualified by the corporation and sponsored by a private nonprofit corporation. Basically, we interpret that to mean that it's a program qualified by, approved by our board, and on a case-by-case basis. An eligible housing project is defined as, again, one that meets that 80% and 60% test that was in the statute, the last one in the statute. That one does not have to meet any other requirement. It's a statutory exemption section. If you're a rental housing project and you meet those income requirements, you are an eligible project. If you're not, then you need to meet income criteria and a development criteria. The income criteria are that at least 20% of the units in the project are rented or sold to households with incomes up to 50% of the area median income, number one. Number two, at least 40% of the units are rented or sold to households with incomes up to 95% of area median income. Or number three, at least 60% of the units must be rented or sold to households with incomes up to 140% of area median income. Those are the income tests. But there's also a development criteria that must be met, which are rental or for sale housing projects which are developed under a housing development program pursuant to Part 2 of Chapter 201H. Rental or for sale housing projects which are developed or required for provision of affordable housing under a government assistance program approved by the corporation. And number three, rental or for sale housing projects developed under the sponsorship of a private nonprofit corporation. Like we just said, needed to be approved on a case-by-case basis by our board. Is a definition of government assistance program, which means housing programs, any housing program qualified by the corporation and administered or operated by the state, the corporation, the United States, or any of their political subdivisions, agencies, or instrumentalities, corporate or otherwise, which may be used to effectuate housing development and acquisition for the provision of affordable housing for qualified persons in the state. And then there's a list of government assistance programs that are included but not limited to, okay? And there's a whole list of them, one of which is the low-income housing tax credit program. And another one, you know, for example, is the rental housing trust fund program. So there's a list of pre-qualified government assistance programs set forth in the rules. The major ones being rental housing trust fund and low-income housing tax credit. Those projects will almost automatically qualify for GET exemption. And the GET exemption for a rental project generally goes to the cost of construction for new construction, the cost of the moderate rehabilitation, or the cost of the substantial rehabilitation, and on an annual basis for the qualified rents. And basically, those are low-income rents, which are, should be defined here. Well, rents for lower-income households, which means households with incomes up to and including 140% of the area median income. There's a fee schedule. For rents received from residential units in the rental housing project may be exempt from general excise tax, provided that an economically integrated housing project in which only a portion of the units in a project are targeted for lower income households. That's what we said is 140% of the area median income. The exemption shall apply only to that portion targeted for lower income households. So in a mixed income project that otherwise qualifies for a rental GET exemption, only the rents for income households at or below 140% of area median income will be exempt from GET. They set forth a application process for newly constructed or rehabilitated housing projects and applications for certification of rental housing projects and the rules, and criteria for determining eligibility. Also, I guess if there's substantial changes, more than 200,000, the forms need to be updated. The GET exemption forms need to be updated and approved. We have a form that lists all of the GET applications that needs to be submitted with an application. The Form G37 is available on our website and the Department of Taxation website, which is the general excise use tax exemption for certified approved housing projects. It sets forth the name of the taxpayer, because every GET taxpayer who's claiming an exemption on the project needs a Form G37 for the amount of their contract. So on a sizable contract, there's usually, I want to say, dozens of G37s filed for the contractor, subcontractors, and those all need to be filled out and approved. And then there's a Schedule A to the G37 for the use tax exemptions, because the project developer or the general contractor needs to file that to get an exemption from use tax on any imported contracting or imported building supplies. Because the contractor or developer would be otherwise liable for the use tax. So I guess that's all I had. This material you should have this material, and it will be made
Yes.
available. So now, Wes.
So, at the end of the project period, after you're no longer subject to the LIHTC requirements or the bond requirements for the low income, does the corporation allow a developer to extend the period so that they can get the benefit of the exemption for the low income units?
I think if I wanna say yes, because typically it's subject to this is for a LIHTC project?
Or LIHTC or a bond,
Well, it's a LIHTC
Yeah.
project. Yeah, because LIHTC projects typically are 60% of the area median in income or below, so the rental would qualify under that statutory provision, nothing else. Because they're 100% and 60% AMI or less.
Yeah. But let's say you're at the end of the mandatory period.
So what's your regulatory agreement period?
Usually it's.
You talk
Usually
about
it's
at the end of the
longer.
regulatory,
Yeah.
are you
30
beyond the regulatory agreement? You're
Yeah.
talking when it expires with that?
Right.
Yeah, okay.
I think typically at the end of 30 years, they come in for moderate or substantial rehab at that point. It's just saying, typically, the facts would probably just apply to the UGET exemption if they came in for substantial or moderate rehab.
But if that's not required, if someone just wants to extend the regulatory period.
I think we have to look at the specific, well, this is for the rents. I think we'd have to look at what the specific facts were, because they might qualify anyway, even without the tax credits. They kept the same rents, they qualify under the statute.
Just from I guess the person who files the applications, it's the different categories. I generally file 3 times. I file for the initial financing. You can get exemptions for the people involved in the financing, lawyers, the underwriters who get paid for a lot for. Just kidding. So the financing costs can be, so the people involved in the financing can get an exemption. So like your firm, if you got fees, you can file to get a tax GET exemption. The next one would be the development and construction. So a lot of reason why you generally file for that is because the schedule that Craig was referring to, you file the G37 generally for the project, get the project qualified as an eligible project, that sort of thing. And then you have the schedule, which you need to update every time you file. So every contractor, subcontract, whatever, will file their G37 in conjunction with that one. And then you can do the separate one for the income of the project. So usually after you do the first one for the financing, which is usually on the heels of the financing with them, the rest is pretty good. Yeah.
And your typical LIHTC project should be pretty smooth sailing.
Right, but it is a separate determination on eligibility. We have a discussion on that, but just because it got approved for the credits, doesn't mean you don't have to get the board's approval for the eligibility for the exemption. You probably will, but you still need to get it, yeah.
You need to qualify a project as an
And one-
eligible project.
And one of the key issues with this is the economic feasibility. There's still a determination by the corporation that the exemption will, I don't wanna say guarantee, but it will enhance, it's not a
It's needed, it helps make the project feasible.
right,
Is
it
that-
helps make the sheet, there's no hard and fast rule, but it needs to
At
be.
that specific income level, at the
Right.
targeted income level.
Right. Essentially, they don't want to give you an exemption so the developer can put it in the market. Yeah. Sure. Just
So
basically.
we never give John an exemption.
But I deserve all the exemptions. No, we're running out of time. So the other credit that, tax credit that projects usually bank on. Okay, so these exemptions, your client in their budgets will have it as exemptions. And the lender, or the, let's say the lender's conventional lender, or, you know, the buyer of the bond, will, in underwriting the conventional part, will look to make sure that you're budgeting, that you're getting the exemption, that your client's getting the exemption. So pretty much need to get the exemption. So, in fact, I've had bond issues where it's actually in there, yeah, that you're getting the exemption. So, the other one that you would, need to get is the real property tax exemption. Generally, the statute, and I forgot to put the site there, but the state statute does authorize the counties to provide real property tax exemptions to projects within their, county. So, since most of the projects are, on Oahu, I've cited that's the revised ordinance of Honolulu section. And they're pretty straightforward. Essentially, that, you said that real property that's operated and, used by a person for a housing project that's subject to a regulatory agreement is exempt from real property taxes in that period. So the key points is that it is a housing project, it's a rental housing project, where 20% of the units are reserved for low-income residents whose median income does not exceed 80% of MHEI. So if you are able to satisfy the minimum set-aside for a tax credit project, and it's, you should be able to qualify for the real property tax exemption. The other thing is, the requirement is that commitment needs to be in a regulatory agreement with a government, which is state, federal agency, or whatever, which is the regulatory agreement that I mentioned earlier. So you have regulatory agreement will serve two purposes. It's a requirement of the tax credit program, but it also will enable you to qualify for the tax, the real property tax exemption. Couple of things. The counties differ a little, but the general rule is that to qualify for the exemption, you need to file, let's say on Oahu, by September 30th of the previous year. So this September 30th, you need to file your exemption in order to have an exemption for 2016. Okay, and on Oahu, it is an annual filing. It's not that difficult. Usually what I do is I do the first one for the client, and their property manager can do the next one, because you just provide a regulatory agreement. You write the letter, they can just copy a letter or whatever, and they'll file it. One thing you need to be aware of though is if you acquire a project in mid-year, you have to file for the exemption within 60 days after you close. If you don't, you lose the exemption. I've had to go back and get it redone. St. Cloud, Honolulu is difficult. I've done it on the Big Island. Big Island, I believe, is not an annual filing. Once you get it, I think you get it for the duration of the regulatory agreement, you just file it once. The city has talked about doing that but they haven't done it yet. So, I think that's it for that one. I think we're done. Do we have anything else? Any questions?
Anybody on the phone have questions? If not, Justin, that was a really wonderful presentation. Thank you so much.